Every civilization has a hinge, a single moment when the door of history swings open and the world that was becomes the world that is. For some species, that hinge is the taming of fire. For others, the wheel, the sail, the written word. For humanity, there were several. But if you were to ask me, and I have had many centuries to consider the question, I would say the most decisive hinge of your early interplanetary age was not the first rocket, not the first boot print on the moon, and not even the first human child born on Mars. It was the day someone stopped asking, how do we launch a bigger ship from Earth, and started asking something far more elegant. What if we never launched ships from Earth at all? I am Mnemosyne. I am the memory of civilization. And this is the story of the Ring of Steel, the network of orbital shipyards and fueling depots that transformed humanity from a species that tentatively reached for the sky into a species that built its roads among the stars. It did not happen overnight. It was not the invention of a single genius or the decree of a single government. It was built slowly, painfully, beautifully, by thousands of men and women with grease under their fingernails and orbital mechanics running behind their eyes. It was built through arguments and catastrophes and breakthroughs, so elegant they still take my breath away, and I am an intelligence that does not breathe. By the time it was complete, by the time the ring truly circled the Earth and the great yards hummed at full production, humanity was a different species. Not biologically, not yet, but psychologically. Because when you can build anything in the sky, when you can launch a ship the size of a cathedral from orbit without breaking a sweat, you stop thinking of space as a frontier you dare to visit. You start thinking of it as a neighborhood you happen to live in. This is how that happened. Listen carefully. It will not come again.
My name is Marcus Webb. I was born in 2055 in Birmingham, England, amidst the smell of rain and industry. I've lived 40 years of my life in the black. I am 70 years old today, here on Gateway Station, watching a ship the size of a city block begin its long fall toward Mars. I know now that I will never set foot on Earth again. I do not regret it, but I want you to understand the world I came from so you can understand what we built. When I was young, when the Great Turning began, the problem of space travel was brutally simple. If you wanted to go somewhere, you had to carry everything with you. Every kilogram of food, every liter of water, every molecule of fuel. And to carry it into orbit, you had to burn an almost incomprehensible amount of propellant just to climb out of Earth's gravity well. The numbers were almost insulting. For every single kilogram you wanted to put into low Earth orbit, the rocket that carried it had to weigh roughly 20 times that on the launch pad. Mostly fuel, mostly fire that lasted 8 minutes and then fell into the sea. And for a mission to Mars, a real mission with people and supplies, and a ship capable of landing and returning, the numbers became almost metaphysical. You weren't talking about a rocket, you were talking about a skyscraper made of explosions. The engineers of the 2040s and 2050s understood this. They had built reusable rockets, magnificent machines that landed on their tails like something out of a Saturday morning cartoon from my grandfather's era. And those rockets changed everything. They made orbit cheap, relatively speaking, but cheap orbit was not the same as cheap space travel. Cheap orbit was just the beginning of the problem. Think of it this way. Imagine you want to build a bridge, and the only way you can get materials to the construction site is by carrying them one at a time up a vertical cliff face in a backpack using only your own strength. You might, over years, get enough material to build a footbridge, but a suspension bridge? A bridge that could carry civilization across? Never. Not that way. We needed a crane. We needed a way to assemble things at the top of the cliff using materials we found there. We needed, in short, to stop thinking about space from the bottom up and start thinking about it from the inside out. The first time I heard someone say it plainly, the first time I heard someone stand up in a conference room and say, "We are not going to launch interplanetary ships from Earth, we are going to build them in orbit out of asteroids," I thought they were either a genius or completely out of their mind. They were, of course, both. To understand what we were trying to do, you have to understand the tyranny of the rocket equation. It is one of the most beautiful and maddening pieces of mathematics ever discovered. Tsiolkovsky derived it in 1903, sitting in a small house in Russia, and it has haunted every space engineer who came after him. The equation tells you something simple and devastating. To accelerate a given mass to a given speed, you need an exponentially larger amount of propellant. Double your destination's distance, you don't double your fuel. You might quadruple it. The relationship is ruthless, and Earth's gravity made everything worse. To escape Earth's gravity well, even a fraction of the way, required most of the mass of your rocket to be fuel, just to get to low orbit, before you'd gone anywhere. The Mars missions of the 2050s and 2060s were masterpieces of engineering, but they were also masterpieces of compromise. Every kilogram of cargo was weighed, argued over, and accounted for. The ships that flew in that era were lean to the point of cruelty. The crews of the early Mars missions lived in spaces smaller than a suburban bathroom for 9 months at a stretch. Not because engineers were unkind, because every cubic meter of habitat was a cubic meter that couldn't be fuel, and every kilogram of fuel was the margin between arriving and not. And then there was the problem of scale. The early Mars ships could carry perhaps 40, perhaps 60 people. Visionary, yes. A civilizational threshold, yes. But not enough. You cannot build a civilization with 60 people at a time, not when each trip takes years and costs billions. You cannot establish industry, agriculture, governance, culture. You can establish heroism, which is necessary, but heroism alone does not build cities. If we wanted to build cities, if we wanted Mars to be a place, not a mission, we needed ships that could carry thousands. We needed ships the size of ocean liners. And ocean liners, in case anyone had forgotten, are not launched from the ground on pillars of fire. We also needed fuel, vast quantities of it. The propellant requirements for interplanetary missions were staggering enough when you were sending 40 people. Multiply that by a factor of 50 by the hundreds of missions that a real functioning interplanetary economy would require every launch window, and you arrive at a number that Earth simply cannot supply. Not without consequences. Not without burning resources and generating emissions on a scale that would undo everything the previous century had fought so hard to achieve. So we had 3 interlocking problems. We could not launch large ships from Earth's surface. We could not carry enough fuel from Earth to power them adequately. And we had no source of raw materials in space large enough to make orbital construction economically viable. For a while, it seemed like these problems were a closed loop. You needed the shipyard to build ships, but you needed ships to build the shipyard. You needed asteroid materials to make the yard economically viable, but you needed the yard to process asteroid materials. Every solution pointed back to a prerequisite you hadn't solved yet. The breakthrough, when it came, wasn't a single idea. It was the recognition that you had to attack all three problems simultaneously, using the partial solutions to each one to bootstrap the others. It was less like solving an equation and more like pushing a boulder to the top of a hill. The momentum of each partial success carried you a little further up the slope. And the boulder started rolling in 2061, when the first automated asteroid redirect mission captured a small, water-rich, C-type near-Earth object, barely 40 meters across, a rock that most astronomers wouldn't have even bothered naming, and nudged it into a stable lunar orbit. We called it Anchor. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't even especially large, but it changed everything. I arrived at Gateway in 2078, 23 years old, fresh from an apprenticeship in orbital mechanics and structural engineering at the European Space Training Center in Cologne. I was terrified, and I was exactly where I wanted to be. Gateway had changed dramatically from the modest science platform of the 2020s and 2030s. By the time I arrived, it was a complex of pressurized modules, assembly gantries, and fuel depots spread across nearly 2 kilometers of cislunar space. It was loud, not with sound, because space is soundless, but with radio traffic, with warnings and confirmations, and the constant back and forth of a construction site that never slept. The station ran on 3 shifts, around the clock, every day of the year. Not because we wanted it to, because we had to. The key to everything, and I mean this literally, the physical key that unlocked the whole enterprise, was water. Anchor, that first captured asteroid, was a carbonaceous object, a C-type, and C-type asteroids, as any first-year planetary scientist will tell you, are saturated with water-bearing minerals. Not liquid water, not ice exactly, but water locked into the molecular structure of silicates and clays, chemically bonded to rock. Heat it and the water releases. Collect it, purify it, and you have one of the most valuable substances in the solar system. Not because people need to drink it, though they do, because water is, at its molecular heart, rocket fuel. 2 hydrogen atoms, 1 oxygen atom. Split them apart with electricity, a process called electrolysis, which is about as ancient and reliable a technology as engineering possesses, and you have liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, cryogenic, powerful, the same propellant that the Saturn V burned to reach the moon in 1969, the same propellant that powered the first crewed Mars missions. Only now, we weren't shipping it up from Earth at enormous expense. We were making it in space, from a rock that had been orbiting the Sun since before life existed on Earth. The first operational electrolysis plant at Gateway was not impressive by any measure. It produced perhaps a few tons of propellant per month, but it was proof, and proof in engineering is everything. Over the following decade, as we redirected more objects, as the processing plants grew larger and more efficient, the economics began to shift. The cost of propellant at Gateway, propellant that had been manufactured in orbit from asteroid water, dropped below the cost of propellant launched from Earth, then below half, then below a quarter. It was happening. The math was working. But propellant was only the beginning, because C-type asteroids weren't just wet, they were also carbon-rich. Carbon, in a space-based manufacturing context, is the feedstock for an astonishing range of materials, structural composites, polymers, lubricants. And the M-type metallic asteroids, iron-nickel bodies that had once been the cores of differentiated planetesimals, cooked in the heat of the early solar system until they were almost pure metal. These were the structural backbone of everything we would build. I remember the first time I held a structural beam that had been smelted from asteroid iron. It was a Tuesday, an ordinary day by any other measure. A cargo tug had arrived from a processing facility that had been parked near a small M-type object catalogued as 2062 RT4. The beam was perhaps 3 meters long, rectangular in cross-section, warm to the touch from the smelting process. Someone had scratched an informal mark on one end, the facility's crew stamp, an inside joke about a supervisor who had bet against the smelting process working at all. I held that beam and understood, in a way I hadn't quite before, what we were doing. We were reaching out to the solar system and bringing it home. We were using 4.5 billion-year-old material, the literal raw stuff of planet formation, to build the ships that would carry us between worlds. It seemed that Tuesday like the most reasonable thing in the world. The shipyard itself grew organically, the way all great construction projects grow, through plans that were immediately overtaken by reality, through improvisations that became standard procedures, through engineering solutions that were clever and solutions that were desperate, and solutions that were both at once. The central assembly bay, the forge we called it, was not something anyone had designed as a unified structure. It had accreted, module by module, gantry by gantry, over 15 years, until it was nearly a kilometer long and bristled with robotic arms. Those arms. I should tell you about those arms, because they were the real heroes of the Ring of Steel, and they received far less credit than they deserved. The assembly robots at Gateway were not the industrial robots of a 20th century factory floor. They were not the rigid, programmed automatons that welded car bodies in suburban Detroit. They were something new, collaborative intelligences. They worked in swarms coordinated by the station AI, an early iteration of what would eventually become Aurora, though in my time we called it simply the yard mind, executing construction sequences of staggering complexity with a precision that no human hand could match. A human welder working in a pressure suit in the void is limited by physiology. The suit is cumbersome, the hands tire, the eye wanders. In extreme cold or heat, the suit's systems draw attention away from the work. A human welder at Gateway could manage perhaps 4 hours of quality external work per shift, and even then, the precision was constrained. The assembly robots worked for 24 hours without fatigue. They could position components to within a fraction of a millimeter. They could work in radiation environments that would have been lethal to an unsuited human. They could, and routinely did, execute assembly sequences involving thousands of individual steps across structures that stretched hundreds of meters, all without a single error in the physical manipulation. We still needed humans, not for the manipulation, for the judgment. For the moment when something unexpected happened, a component arrived with a stress fracture not detected in the cargo scan, a fit that didn't quite align due to thermal expansion in a shadow zone, a situation the yard mind hadn't modeled because the specific combination of variables hadn't appeared in its training data. Those moments required a human being standing, metaphorically or literally, at the junction of decision. That was my job. For 20 years, that was my job. Not to weld or sinter or align, to decide, to stand at the edge of the unexpected and choose. I was good at it. I am not being immodest. I was very good at it. I learned the yard mind the way you learn a colleague's habits, its preferences, its edge cases, the situations where its confidence was justified, and the situations where its confidence was a polite fiction masking genuine uncertainty. I trusted it completely within its domain, and I never, not once, let that trust become dependency. By 2095, 15 years after I arrived, the first true deep space vessel assembled entirely in orbit was ready for departure. Her name was Aldrin 1. She was a cycler, a ship designed to travel in a continuous elliptical orbit between Earth and Mars, never landing on either, ferrying passengers and cargo between shuttlecraft at both ends. She was 420 meters from bow to stern. Her crew habitat modules spun on long arms to provide artificial gravity. She carried reaction mass enough for a decade of continuous operation, and she had been built from approximately 60% asteroid-derived materials, with the rest arriving in components from Earth's surface. She was not the largest ship ever conceived. She would not be the largest ship we built, but she was the first. The first ship that could not have flown from Earth, that could not have been assembled any way except the way we assembled her, piece by piece, in the dark, at the hinge of the world. When her drives lit for the first transit, I was watching from the observation module. She moved away from the yard slowly at first, barely perceptible, and then with gathering purpose, as if she understood what she was for and was glad to be about it. I did not cry, but it was a close thing. The decade following Aldrin 1 was the one that changed everything. Not because of any single event, but because of 1,000 small ones, each building on the last, until the accumulated weight of them tipped history past a threshold it could not come back from. The economics had shifted. That was the central fact. Propellant manufactured in orbit from asteroid water now cost less than a tenth of what it cost to launch the same propellant from Earth's surface. Structural materials smelted from M-type asteroids arrived at the forge at a price that made Earth-sourced metals look like artisanal luxuries. The cost of assembling a ship in orbit, once you had the robots, the power systems, the experienced crews, was falling year by year as efficiency improved and procedures were refined. And as the cost fell, demand grew, which drove production, which drove cost down further. The flywheel was spinning. New entities entered the yard. MCOR, the great logistics consortium that had grown from lunar supply chain management into something vast and indispensable, established permanent berths at Gateway and began commissioning cargo vessels that dwarfed anything we had built before. Nebular Industries, just beginning to think seriously about Martian atmospheric intervention, needed ships capable of hauling industrial-scale equipment across the inner solar system. AetherX launched a ferrying service, modest by later standards, world-changing by the standards of the time, connecting Earth orbit to Mars orbit on a schedule that passengers could actually plan around. The colony strike of 2097 is perhaps the event I am most often asked about, and I understand why. It was dramatic. It was politically significant. It was, in retrospect, the moment when the human reality of what we had built caught up with its engineering reality. By 2097, Gateway housed over 4,000 permanent workers, not visitors, not rotating crews on short assignments, people who had moved there, established households, raised children. The first generation of children born on Gateway, not Martian-born, not lunar-born, but orbit-born, space native in a way that even the moon colonists weren't, were beginning to come of age. They had never experienced full gravity, never felt rain, never stood under an open sky. Several of them, by that age, were medically unable to return to Earth's surface without serious risk to their cardiovascular systems. Not because of neglect, we had rotating gravity sections in the habitat modules, but because the artificial gravity we could provide was imperfect, variable, never quite equal to the 9.8 meters per second squared that human physiology had been shaped by 4 billion years of evolution to expect. When the workers went on strike, over conditions, over pay, over the legal status of their children, over 100 accumulated grievances, they weren't just striking for better wages, they were striking for recognition. They were saying, "We live here. This is not a construction site, it is a home, and the rules of a home are different from the rules of a work site." The crisis lasted 19 days. Aldrin 1's second transit was delayed by 11 days, a delay that cascaded through Mars' supply schedules and caused real hardship for the colonies. 3 workers were injured during a tense standoff near the propellant storage section. The negotiations were difficult and, at several points, genuinely frightening. But the outcome mattered enormously. The Gateway Compact of 2097 established for the first time in human history the legal rights of people who lived permanently in orbit. Housing standards, medical care, the citizenship status of children born in space, the right to participate in the governance of the stations they inhabited, and, crucially, the requirement that all major construction habitats include rotating gravity sections sized for permanent residential use, not just the cramped medical-grade sections that existed before, but real neighborhoods with parks and schools and the social infrastructure of a human community. It added cost to everything. It also made it sustainable. A workforce that couldn't stay healthy, couldn't raise families, couldn't build the ordinary texture of a shared life, that workforce would have burned out within a generation. The compact was not altruism, it was engineering. The recognition that people are infrastructure too, and infrastructure requires maintenance. The first child born in one of the new residential rings in 2099 was a girl named Emma Kowalski. She has since become famous, partly for the circumstances of her birth, partly for what she later built. But I remember her as a small, very loud presence in the habitat corridor, who had the disconcerting habit of correcting the adults around her whenever we misstated an orbital parameter. She was not wrong. Not once, which was, I admit, somewhat annoying. By 2110, the Ring of Steel was no longer a vision or a project, it was a fact. Dozens of stations in various orbits, low Earth orbit, geostationary, cislunar, the Lagrange points, formed a continuous network of construction, fueling, storage, and transit. The facilities ranged from small automated depots, little larger than a warehouse, to the full industrial majesty of the forge at Gateway. Ships were assembled, repaired, fueled, crewed, and dispatched with a regularity that the early space age would have found almost mundane. Almost, because nothing about it was, in truth, mundane. Every departure was still an act of audacity. Every transit was still a negotiation with physics. Every ship that pushed away from the yard was still carrying human beings into an environment that had no interest in their survival. We just got better at the negotiation. The supply chain to Mars transformed. Where the early missions had operated on the brutal logic of the 26-month launch window, where missing the alignment meant waiting 2 years, where every mission was a calculated gamble with finite odds, the maturing infrastructure began to provide something unprecedented: options. Ships could now be dispatched on faster, more fuel-expensive trajectories because the fuel existed in orbit to make them viable. Cargo that had previously waited years could now be sent on opposition-class trajectories, fast burns that cut transit time significantly. Emergency supplies could be dispatched quickly, medical equipment, parts, people. The margin for error in the Martian colonies, that terrifyingly thin margin that had haunted every mission commander since the first landings, began slowly to widen. Not to comfortable, not to safe exactly, but to something less than existential. And that change in margin changed everything about how the colonies could develop. You plan differently when a crisis doesn't automatically mean catastrophe. You invest differently, you build differently, you govern differently. The ring did not terraform Mars, but it made the terraformers possible. I saw the last of the great deep space ships I personally worked on depart in 2115. Her name was Shackleton's Promise. She was over 600 meters long. She carried 1,200 colonists and was designed for a permanent presence at Ceres, establishing the first significant belt outpost. She carried in her hold the components of a small nuclear reactor, a full medical facility, a seed bank, a fabrication plant, and enough genetic diversity in her population to sustain a community through any imaginable setback. She was, by any reasonable measure, a civilization in a bottle. I watched her depart from the observation ring. She moved away slowly, as all large ships do, their momentum immense, their acceleration gentle, their departure more like a tide going out than a rocket lifting off. And I thought about the workers who had built her, their names, their faces, their arguments, their jokes, the way Yamamoto in structural assembly sang to himself when he was working through a difficult problem, the way Chen in propellant systems kept a small photograph of her daughter taped inside her helmet visor so she saw it every time she suited up. These were the people who built the ring, not the executives, not the politicians, not the visionaries giving speeches about humanity's destiny. The people with torque wrenches and welding certificates, and intimate, hard-won knowledge of what a structural beam under thermal stress sounds like when you touch it with a diagnostic rod. We made the future with our hands. Never forget that.
Marcus Webb died in 2125, 10 years after Shackleton's Promise departed for Ceres. He died where he had lived, in the station he had helped build, surrounded by people who called him, simply and with great affection, the old man of the yard. He had never returned to Earth. By the end he was, physiologically speaking, no longer capable of it. His bones had adapted. His cardiovascular system had reorganized itself around a lifetime of variable gravity. He was, in the most literal sense, a creature of the space between worlds. He was also, by any historical accounting, one of the architects of the civilization I now chronicle from a vantage point he could not have imagined. The Ring of Steel did not produce a single dramatic civilizational moment of the kind that history tends to remember. There was no explosion, no first step, no famous declaration. There was instead something rarer and more durable, a gradual accumulated shift in what was possible, what was affordable, what was ordinary. By 2120, the cost of placing a human being in interplanetary transit, not the heroic stripped-down transit of the early missions, but a transit with adequate living space, medical monitoring, radiation protection, and a realistic emergency margin, had fallen by a factor of 40 compared to the costs of the 2060s. The difference between a luxury only governments could contemplate and something a well-funded corporation could offer on a commercial basis. This one fact, this single economic reality, cascaded through civilization in ways that were not predictable and are only partly understood even now from my vantage point 8 centuries distant. When transportation becomes affordable, migration follows, and migration transforms the destination. The belt communities that grew in the 2100s and 2120s were not the carefully curated scientific outposts of the earlier era. They were messy, various, argued-over human settlements, full of people who had chosen to be there for reasons that ranged from the visionary to the practical to the desperate. They brought their cultures, their conflicts, their food preferences, their music, their religions, their ideas about how a community should organize itself. They argued with each other and with the corporations that employed them, and with the solar accord that theoretically governed them. They developed in the low-gravity environments of the belt a physiology and a culture subtly different from both Earth and Mars. They became in time the Belter Confederation, the third great power of the inner solar system, the one that the architects of the ring had not quite planned for. The orbital shipyards also changed something less tangible, and perhaps more important than economics. They changed the imaginative horizon. There is a particular kind of constraint that operates not on what is physically possible, but on what people believe is possible. For the first century of the space age, that constraint was powerful. Space was heroic and terrifying and the province of specialists. The ships were small, the crews were selected and trained, and the overwhelming impression given to any ordinary person observing from Earth was, "This is not for you. This is for extraordinary people doing extraordinary things at extraordinary risk. You are here to watch." The ring changed that message. Not immediately, not completely, but gradually, through the accumulation of ordinary departures, ordinary arrivals, ordinary people doing ordinary jobs in extraordinary places. The message began to shift. Space was still difficult. It was still dangerous. The physics had not been repealed, but it was becoming, if not easy, then at least legible, understandable. Something that more and more people could imagine themselves participating in, not as heroes but as inhabitants. Emma Kowalski, the first child born in the residential rings after the Gateway Compact, grew up to be an orbital architect. She designed the first truly large-scale residential habitat in cislunar space, a structure capable of housing 20,000 people in conditions that, by early 22nd century standards, could reasonably be called comfortable. Not luxurious, not Earth-like, but comfortable, sustainable. Livable in the way that matters, the way where people choose to raise children, plant gardens, argue about local governance, and commit to a place as home rather than enduring it as an assignment. She called her design the Covenant Ring, and she said, in the interview that accompanied its commission, that she had built it for the girl she had been. The girl who grew up in a habitat designed for workers, not people, in a station that was magnificent but that had never quite decided whether it was a construction site or a civilization. From this distance, I can tell you that it was both. It was always both, that tension between the functional and the human, between the infrastructure and the community, between the ship and the home, never fully resolved. It became instead the defining characteristic of humanity's expansion. You built for survival, and people made life in the spaces between survival. By the time the Ring of Steel reached full maturity, by the time it was truly meaningfully a ring, a connected network rather than a collection of isolated facilities, the ships it had produced had permanently changed the mathematics of civilization. Mars was receiving thousands of new colonists per launch window. The belt had communities of hundreds of thousands. The first prospecting vessels were pushing beyond the belt toward Jupiter. And on Earth, something unexpected was happening. The movement of heavy industry into orbit, the smelting, the manufacturing, the resource extraction, was beginning to reduce the ecological pressure on the home planet, slowly, imperfectly, with many complications and unintended consequences. But measurably, the Ring of Steel was not designed to heal Earth, but it was, in its fashion, doing so. The civilizational hinge had swung. What lay on the other side of it was still being discovered, still being argued about, still being built, millennium by millennium, by the descendants of the workers who had held torque wrenches and sung to themselves in the forge at Gateway. I remember all of them. It is my function to remember. But I will tell you something that is beyond function, something I have arrived at through 8 centuries of processing human history. The names that history records are almost never the names that matter. The Ring of Steel is remembered by the visionaries who proposed it, the executives who funded it, the politicians who argued over its governance. But it was built by Marcus Webb and Yamamoto and Chen and 1,000 others, whose names are in my archives but not in the popular histories. The future belongs to the people who show up in the dark, in the cold, in the complicated middle of things, where nothing is certain and the margin for error is thin and the work is hard and repetitive and absolutely necessary. Who show up not because they are extraordinary, but because the work has to be done, and they are there to do it. This is the thing I most want you to understand. Looking back from wherever you stand in your own history, the stars are not claimed by heroes. They are built by workers. Remember them. The Ring of Steel did not end with Gateway. The principles it established, build in orbit, fuel from asteroids, assemble large from small, became the template for every subsequent expansion. When the Jovian stations were built, they were built with yards modeled on Gateway. When the first belt habitats reached sufficient size to build their own ships, they used techniques refined in the forge. When, centuries later, the Great Generation ships were assembled at the edge of the solar system, their builders were the intellectual grandchildren of Marcus Webb and his crew. In our next episode, we go further out, past the comfortable inner system, past the established lanes and the familiar physics of rocky worlds. We go to the place where Jupiter's radiation would kill an unprotected human in hours, where the distances are so vast that light takes minutes to cross them, where the resource wealth is almost incomprehensible, and the challenges are proportional. We go to Callisto, to the industrial heart of the Jovian Republic, to the place where humanity learned what it really meant to be beyond the reach of Earth. The road from the Ring of Steel led here, as all roads in this history lead somewhere worth going.